Belief and unbelief. Before we go there, though, wasn't that a great hymn? Yeah. So does anybody know anything about Horatio G. Spafford, the author of the hymn? You can't ever forget that name, can you? Horatio G. I don't remember what the G is for, but Horatio Spafford. It's kind of like, yeah. No one hears names like that anymore. Horatio, so you know something about him, of course. Anybody else? You know something about him. Awesome. And Marianne knows something about him. Awesome. What do you know about him?
He endured great tragedy.
He endured great tragedy. And the great tragedy was a complex tragedy, not just a simple tragedy. He lived in Chicago, and he was a businessman in Chicago, a successful businessman in Chicago. And his success kind of reached its peak just at about the time of the Great Chicago Fire, which burned down his business, burned up everything, it destroyed a big chunk of Chicago, but his business went up in flames, literally. And he had nothing. And so while he was trying to rebuild and kind of get things started again, he decided to send his wife and daughters to a vacation in Europe. Anybody want to go on a vacation in Europe? That sounds like a good idea for spend 6 months in Europe and vacationing. So he sent them off, and they got on a ship, I think in New York City, and were sailing to Europe, and about halfway across the Atlantic, the ship sunk. And his wife and his daughters all died. So first the tragedy of his business, then on top of that the tragedy of losing his entire family. And so to console himself and to try to make some peace with it, he decided then to take a cruise on the same route. Obviously not the same ship, but on the same route, across the same route. And he said about the time that they passed over the place where the ship had sunk, he said he got this sense of peace. And some of these words started to come to him. And he wrote them down, and at a later point they were put to music by a composer. But in that moment, of passing over that area, it's that he could only attribute it to God's work in his heart. That great grief of all his loss, of everything that was his life, was suddenly, it wasn't gone, but it was suddenly bearable. And he knew that God was working in there somewhere. And thus we have the hymn from Horatio G. Spafford. Anyway, which is probably also another good example of belief and unbelief. But this morning we have a father who's was it a daughter? It was a daughter, right? A son. Whose son is afflicted by a demon. And we might want to look at that and say, well, maybe it was epilepsy, maybe it was some other neurological disorder or something, or physical issue. But Mark is pretty clear, and all the other Gospels are clear too. They say it's due to a demon. So I kind of go with that and say, okay, it's due to demonic possession. There's something horrible happening to the son. And he's at his wit's end. He's tried everything. And he does everything he can to keep his son from being harmed. And it's day after day after day of like jumping in for something. And he comes to Jesus, and the phrase always sticks, that cry always sticks with me. I believe. Help my unbelief. Now, I think in the world today, and around in popular culture and things like that, people assume that, hey, you come to church, you must believe. You believe all the time. It's good. No, it ain't like that, is it? It isn't like that. There are these moments of unbelief. These moments that just shake you to the core. Things happen. Right? Horatio G. Spafford, when he got the telegram, boat is sunk, all are gone. I mean, how do you have belief in that? How do you that's just your world is shattered. And yet somewhere in there, God is working. Maybe we don't know about Horatio. Maybe Bart does. Bart's pretty well read in all kinds of things. But maybe it was the people around him. Maybe it was in his own prayer life, something. We don't know. He got the sense that all was not lost. And that's true of this father too. He's tried everything, and he comes to here. He's heard about Jesus. He comes to Jesus, And, Jesus says, Jesus helps him. It's pretty straightforward. Jesus helps him. I believe, help my unbelief. And I think that right there, that those two things can coexist in us. It's not like you don't have enough belief. It's like there's always that question somewhere in the background. And that question comes from the question asked of Eve and Adam in the garden. What did the snake say to Eve and Adam, who was right near her? Did God really say? So Satan is always about us casting doubt. Particularly doubt in Jesus' promises, doubt in the Word of God, doubt in our fellowship. Okay, that's Satan's job. That's what Satan does. It does real well. Lots of practice. And there's that doubt. And so the man comes and he says, I believe. I trust you, Jesus. The Greek word can mean belief or trust. I trust you, Jesus. Help my distrust. Think about that. Help my uncertainty. I'm certain. Help my uncertainty. Oh, it's kind of a mess. And emotionally, it is a mess in real life. And Jesus helps him. Jesus helps him. Jesus helps us in our unbelief. Jesus, I believe. Jesus, I trust you, but this is overwhelming. Help my distrust in the overwhelmingness of all this. Help me understand how to go on. Help me understand how to live with this grievous wound. And when we're wounded, and he helps us live, we're like that resurrected Jesus. We have a new life in us. Because if you remember, the resurrected Jesus wasn't all perfect, right? He still had the wounds. See my hands, see my feet. Put your hand in my side. Literally in the Greek, throw your hand, thrust your hand into my side. The wounds are still there. And yet, by the power of God, he lives on, and we live on, to proclaim the glory, the love, the mercy, the hope that we know through Jesus Christ. Now, I think as we go out and as we, are interacting with others, we're good. Remember, if we think about it like, I didn't just meet this person by chance. Every time I meet someone, God has orchestrated it in some way for something. God's using us as his messengers. If you kind of go at it from that perspective, then there's a message here, an important message that doesn't have to be spoken directly, but can kind of shape what you say and what you do. Remember last week, James, what we say and do are both important? Okay. So what you say and do, in that you can believe and not believe at the same time. You can have trust and distrust at the same time in a mixture. And Jesus still works through that. And Jesus still helps through that mess. Because life is messy. It is. All right? So maybe someone this week needs to hear from you that, hey, sounds like you're having, you're having a little trouble believing. I can imagine that's true. In my life at this point, when this thing happened, I was having trouble believing. But God showed me the way through and helped me helped lift up my belief. And God can help you too.